Picture this: you're shackled at the wrists, your feet bleeding on frozen ground. The roar of the longships fades behind you as a horn sounds. Around you, dozens of others, women, men, even children, are herded like cattle into a smoky village. And as the Norse chieftain steps forward to inspect the new arrivals, you realise something terrible. You aren't here to serve or to work. You're here to entertain, to submit, to be owned, body and soul. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're building a global community of history lovers. For centuries, the Viking Age has been bathed in romantic myth. Rugged explorers with horned helmets which they never wore, sailing across icy seas in search of glory and gold. But beneath the surface of this familiar legend lies a grim, rarely told reality. Because for every bearded warrior brandishing an axe, there were dozens of victims, captives torn from their homes, sold like livestock and forced into lives that defy modern comprehension. These weren't just field slaves or domestic servants. Many were subjected to a far more intimate, harrowing fate. They became what the sagas and chronicles hint at, but rarely name, pleasure slaves. The Norse called them threll, a word that slips easily past the lips of poets and historians, but it cloaked horrors few dared to write down. These were the enslaved bodies used not just for labour, but for the satisfaction, domination, and perverse rituals of their masters. And while their names have vanished from history, their pain left shadows in the stories the Vikings told about themselves. Sagas filled with conquest, cruelty, and control. Our journey begins not with the Vikings themselves, but with the victims. Let us go back to the year 845 AD, to the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne has died, and the empire he once held together with iron and blood is splintering. Along the Seine, the city of Paris stands watchful and proud and unmarred. But from the sea comes something else, something new. A flotilla of ships, shaped like dragons, slicing through the river's surface like knives. At their helm, the infamous Ragnar Lodbrok, or someone using his name, leads hundreds of Viking raiders inland, and what they bring is more than destruction. It is extraction. In these early raids, the Vikings didn't come to settle. Not yet. They came to take. Gold, yes. Silver, certainly. But most of all, people. Frankish chronicles speak of entire villages depopulated overnight. The elderly were slaughtered. The healthy and the young were bound and dragged back to ships. Commodities for trade, trophies for warlords, or offerings for their gods. The lines between those fates blurred quickly, especially for the women. In the Norse worldview, to dominate another human physically, sexually, psychologically was not a perversion. It was a validation of power, and slaves became the canvas upon which that power was painted. By the time the Vikings established the Danelaw in parts of England and built settlements in Ireland and Iceland, the practice had grown into an institution. Markets sprung up in Dublin, Hedeby and Birka, trading posts teeming with foreign slaves. Byzantine emissaries recorded them. Arab travellers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan described them. Blonde-haired girls from the Baltics, Slavic boys from the East and dark-haired women from Iberia, all sold in open air to men who saw them as objects of status and possession. And among these captives were those who would not just scrub floors or haul firewood. They would be brought inside dressed up or stripped bare, trained to dance, to sing, to satisfy. The Norse elite, especially the jarls and chieftains, took pleasure slaves as symbols of their wealth and masculinity. A powerful Viking might own a dozen thralls, but only a few would be chosen for the bedroom. And that choice was always an assertion of control. Some sagas even hint at these arrangements with grim detachment. The Laxdæla saga, for example, describes the Norseman Olaf the Peacock acquiring an Irish slave woman of exceptional beauty. She was gifted to him like a prize horse, passed from man to man, renamed, and finally made into the mother of his children, though still legally a slave. Her feelings, her past, her name, lost. These women, and occasionally men, endured lifetimes of psychological terror. They lived at the mercy of their owners' whims. Some were beaten for amusement. Others were forced into ritualized sexual displays like during the Blots, sacrificial festivals where carnal dominance was seen as pleasing to the gods. For them, even death could be stolen. Some were buried with their masters, suffocated or stabbed, so that they might serve in the afterlife. And yet these stories remain fragments. Why? Because they were never meant to survive. Norse culture preserved the names of raiders, kings, poets, not victims. But archaeology has started to uncover what words refuse to say. Graves of high-status Viking men have been found with the remains of young foreign women placed at their feet like offerings. Some show signs of trauma, others have been arranged in postures of submission. DNA testing has confirmed these were not local women. They were taken. As the Viking world expanded, stretching from Greenland to Constantinople, the demand for human bodies only grew, and in places like Kiev, ruled by the Rus, Viking descendants themselves, the slave trade reached industrial levels. The Rus exported men and women in chains down the Dnieper River to the markets of the Caliphate, where the concept of pleasure slavery was already well established. The Vikings weren't just participating in this economy, they were thriving in it. Still, none of this answers the central, most haunting question. What was it like to be a pleasure slave in a Viking household? We don't have their words, but we can try, carefully, respectfully, to imagine. Imagine the cold. You were taken from a warm village, from son and family, and brought to a land where the sky was always grey. You don't speak their language, and you don't understand their gears. Every night, footsteps outside your door mean fear. Every time you're summoned, it might be for cleaning or for worse, and when they smile at you, it's not out of kindness, it's pride. You are proof of their conquests, their status, their cruelty. But some resisted. Some found ways to survive through subtle defiance, manipulation, or silent endurance. And it is their inner strength, not the brutality of their masters, that deserves our attention next. But what does resistance look like when every part of your existence has been stripped away? For the pleasure slaves of the Viking world, resistance rarely came in the form of rebellion. There were no torches, no uprisings. Instead, it was quiet. It was in the refusal to break, in the stolen glances between captives, in the names they whispered to themselves at night to remember who they were. Take, for example, the story of Melkorka, a name hidden in the Laxdæla saga, buried under layers of myth and male narration. She was introduced simply as a mute Irish slave girl purchased in Norway and taken to Iceland by a man named Huskuld. For months, she never spoke a word. He used her as he wished, believing her to be simple, even stupid. But one night, when he struck her out of frustration, she turned to him and in perfect noble Irish cursed him. She had never been mute. She had chosen silence. Her real name was Melkorka, daughter of an Irish king, taken by slavers and sold into a life she had never consented to. In that moment, her defiance wasn't just reclaiming language, it was reclaiming identity, a psychological rebellion, in a world where identity was the first thing stolen. Melkorka's son, Olaf the Peacock, born of rape but raised in wealth, would later travel to Ireland and confirm her story. He met his grandfather, the Irish king, and stood face to face with the lineage that had almost been erased. But Melkorka never returned. Her story ends in Iceland, still technically a slave, though now treated with ambiguous reverence, an echo of who she had been. Her tale is just one of many, but it offers something rare, a voice, however faint, emerging from the darkness. But not all such voices were treated with even that much dignity. In the Norse poem Eirik Smal, composed to honour the death of King Eric Bloodaxe, the afterlife is imagined as a mead hall of warriors, where the slain rejoice in endless battle and feasting. But what of the women buried with them, sometimes alive, sometimes strangled, sometimes stabbed? Archaeologists uncovered one such grave near Birka, Sweden. Inside lay the body of a high-ranking Viking man, surrounded by weapons, finery, and the body of a young woman. Her bones showed signs of a violent death. She had been buried with him, not as an equal, but as an accessory, not a wife, not a lover, a possession. Historians long debated whether this was a human sacrifice or something ritualized, but the conclusion becomes more chilling when we consider her likely status: a slave, possibly a pleasure slave, killed to follow her master into death as if her life were merely an extension of his. And while Norse sources try to elevate such practices as part of a warrior's honour, Arab accounts paint a far grimmer picture. The 10th century traveller Ahmed ibn Fadlan, sent by the Abbasid Caliphate to the lands of the Volga Bulgars, encountered the Rus, Viking traders and raiders who had settled in Eastern Europe. He described their appearance in detail: tall, blonde, heavily tattooed, armed to the teeth. But what haunted him most wasn't their armour. It was the ritual sacrifice he witnessed. A slave girl, described as cheerful at first, was chosen to accompany her dead master into the afterlife. She was given intoxicants, made to sleep with the warriors in a ritualized farewell, and then brought aboard the ship where her master's corpse lay. There, after more rites, she was brutally killed by an old woman known as the Angel of Death. Ibn Fadlan wrote the account with horror. He saw the girl's initial smiles not as consent, but as resignation, a social expectation masked as loyalty. This was no honour, it was obliteration. And yet, among the Vikings, this was revered. The slave's death was necessary, her suffering sanctified. But strip away the ritual, and what remains is the same raw truth. Her life was never hers, not her body, not her fate. This mingling of religion, power, and sexuality reveals the deeper sickness at the heart of the Viking slave system. For the Norse elite, domination wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. To own a person was to reshape them, to annihilate their past and graft them into your myth. Some slaves were given new names, names that fit their master's language, their tongue, their pleasure. Others had their original names mocked or forgotten entirely. And for those designated as pleasure slaves, this annihilation was often absolute. Their worth was measured in obedience, in silence, in submission. The very things that made them human, memory, voice, love, were liabilities, risk factors. But not every Viking accepted this as noble. As the influence of Christianity seeped into the Norse world, first through monks taken captive, then through conversions for political convenience, a crack began to form in the warrior culture's moral armour. Christian monks, like those at Lindisfarne, were among the first to write about the horror they witnessed. Though filtered through their own religious lens, their descriptions of human trafficking, abuse and degradation cast a stark light on Viking practices. The heathens, as they called them, weren't just killing, they were profiting from human suffering. And in the newly Christianized Viking courts of the 11th century, voices began to emerge, timid at first, condemning some of these rituals. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf II Haraldsson outlawed certain forms of slavery and sacrificial rites as part of their campaign to Christianize Norway. But even then, it wasn't morality that drove them, it was politics, a need to be seen as civilized by European standards. The pleasure slaves still existed, they just went deeper underground. By the end of the Viking Age, around 1006, after the failed invasion of England by Harald Hardrada, the world was changing. Christian monarchies were replacing pagan chieftains, trade was becoming more regulated, laws began to define rather than destroy personhood. But for the countless captives already taken, these changes came too late. They had lived, suffered, and died in silence. And still, some of their bloodlines endured. Because while many pleasure slaves were discarded or killed, others gave birth. Children born of forced unions, neither fully free nor fully enslaved, found themselves walking an impossible line. Some, like Olaf the Peacock, were raised into privilege, even fame. Others were treated as half-breeds, their mother's origins used as a stain against them. Their very existence was a living reminder of violence, of conquest, of survival against impossible odds. And that legacy, painful, buried but real, still lingers today. In the lands once ruled by Viking kings, place names bear hints of this past. Genetic studies in Iceland, Ireland, and the British Isles have revealed maternal lineages that don't match the local population. Traces of Baltic, Slavic, Iberian, and even North African ancestry, carried not by warriors, but by women taken across oceans, raped and forgotten. Their voices may never fully return, but their blood has endured. And in Section 3, we'll turn our gaze to one of the most shocking chapters of this story, how Viking women, wives, shield maidens, and priestesses were not only bystanders, but sometimes participants in this brutal system. The question is, how far would someone go to preserve their own status, even if it meant becoming a master of the enslaved? The most unsettling truths are the ones that challenge our assumptions, not just about villains, but about those we expect to be victims. We imagine Viking women as either helpless captives or legendary warriors, romanticized shield maidens who fought alongside men, or tragic wives left behind to mourn their fallen lovers. But the truth, like everything in Viking society, is more complicated and darker, because some Viking women, especially those of noble blood, were not just complicit in the system of slavery. They helped run it. They participated in the domination of pleasure slaves. They managed them. trained them, and on occasion even punished them. Power, after all, is intoxicating to more than just men. In the sagas, women like Queen Gunhild, wife of Eric Bloodaxe, are portrayed with a curious duality: seductive and cunning, cruel yet commanding. According to the Egil's saga, she was accused of using sorcery, of manipulating men with both her body and her mind. But beneath the supernatural slander lies a more grounded truth. Gunhild was a woman with authority in a world that offered women few paths to it. And one of those paths was through control over other women, especially slaves. In wealthy Norse households, the mistress of the home, known as the husfreyja, was responsible not just for managing provisions and children, but for disciplining slaves. That included the pleasure slaves. It was she who determined their duties. It was she who ensured their obedience. And often, it was she who enforced punishment when lines were crossed, or when jealousy burned too hot. Because let's be clear, pleasure slaves posed a threat to Viking wives. These enslaved women, selected for their beauty, youth, and pliability, were constant reminders of a woman's own vulnerability. A jarl or chieftain might lavish more affection on his thrall than on his lawful wife. Some even fathered children with their slaves while treating their wives as mere partners in political alliances. Resentment simmered. There are sagas where the husfreyja beats or maims a female slave for bearing her husband's child. In others, slaves are deliberately crippled to reduce their desirability. One particularly chilling tale tells of a mistress who blinded her husband's concubine with a sewing needle. The act is described almost clinically: no reflection, no remorse, as if such brutality were a matter of household maintenance, and sometimes the cruelty became ritualized. In high-status ceremonies, particularly in sacrificial rites or death feasts, it was not uncommon for a female slave to be selected for sexual performance, then death. What's often overlooked is who selected her: the mistress, the women of the household. They would dress her, prepare her, and instruct her, and ultimately abandon her. Why? Because in a society where a woman's power depended entirely on her alignment with a man, her father, her husband, her son, being above someone else, anyone else, became essential. Even if that meant overseeing the destruction of another woman. But not all Viking women were cold masters. Some felt empathy for the captives, especially if they themselves had once been slaves. In an ironic twist of fate, a pleasure slave who earned her master's favour might rise in status, even be freed, and marry into the household. But there's a memory of what she endured, what she had to become in order to survive, never left, and neither did the knowledge that she now stood above others like herself. A grim cycle began to emerge, the dominated becoming the dominator. Survival morphing into control. One account from the Icelandic Sturlunga saga describes a woman named Thorbjörg, who had once been taken as a slave during a feud, forced to serve in a household where she endured years of sexual violence. Eventually she was freed, not out of mercy, but because her captor had grown bored of her. She married another man and gained a modest standing in the community. Years later, when she herself took in a young Irish thrall, she replicated the exact same treatment she had once suffered, controlling when the girl ate, how she dressed, and even offering her to guests. When questioned, Thorbjörg reportedly answered, "This is the way of the house. I learned it from better hands than mine." It is here that the tragedy deepens, because the legacy of Viking pleasure slavery was not just one of chains and beatings. It was psychological, a learned pattern of abuse, passed from hand to hand like a curse. It taught the powerless to crave scraps of power. It taught the oppressed that safety came not through justice but through proximity to cruelty. And it ensured that the system sustained itself, even as the old gods fell and the new ones rose. Christianity did eventually reach the Viking world, and with it came new laws, new morals, and new hypocrisies. The church condemned certain types of sexual slavery, particularly those involving pagan rituals. But other forms of exploitation were quietly tolerated, especially if the enslaved were considered heathens themselves. In fact, in newly Christian Viking kingdoms, sexual servitude was sometimes justified as an act of conversion, saving the soul while destroying the body. Even women who became nuns or entered Christian orders were not always spared. Some were former slaves trying to escape the shame of their pasts. Others were daughters of these unions, cast-offs who didn't quite belong among the noble or the enslaved. They lived in monasteries not as saints, but as secrets. And for the women who stayed in the Norse households, the roles remained familiar. The Husfreyja still managed the slaves, the pleasure slaves still suffered, and the cycle of silence continued. But outside the walls of longhouses, the world was shifting. Trade routes were changing, kingdoms were consolidating, and for the first time laws began to reflect, however imperfectly, a growing discomfort with the institution of slavery itself. By the late 12th century, slavery was gradually outlawed across Scandinavia. Iceland formally abolished it in 1117, followed by Norway and Sweden in the century after. But let's be honest, abolition on paper does not erase centuries of trauma, and it certainly doesn't unmake the lives that had already been broken. In our next section, Section 4, we'll uncover what happened to the children of these pleasure slaves, the ones born in limbo, raised with one foot in the house of their master and the other in the abyss. Were they cursed by the sins of their fathers, or could they somehow become more than the sum of their suffering? They were born between worlds, children of conquest, of silence, of trauma. Their mothers had no say, their fathers wore swords, and in the frozen hearths of Viking longhouses, these children grew up carrying the invisible weight of their origins. They were not fully free nor fully enslaved. They were reminders, embodiments of power imposed, not earned, and for many their lives became a long, slow negotiation between acceptance and erasure. Some were absorbed into the family line, raised as fosterlings or even heirs, if their father chose to acknowledge them. But for most, their place in society was precarious. These children were frilla-born, born of concubines or more bluntly of slaves, and in the Viking world blood mattered. But so did legitimacy, and take again the case of Olaf the Peacock, the son of Melkorka. Born in Iceland in the 10th century, Olaf's story is unique not just because we know it, but because it survives in the Laxdæla saga written long after his death. Raised as the son of a powerful landowner, Olaf's foreign features, dark hair, almond-shaped eyes, set him apart. People whispered about his origins. He was wealthy, he was respected, but he was also the son of a slave, and he lived in the shadow of that contradiction. It's no coincidence that Olaf's nickname was the Peacock. He was known for his extravagant clothing, his polished demeanour, his desire to perform wealth and control. Some historians believe it was compensation, a way of masking the shame imposed by society for a birth he didn't choose. But not every frilla-born child had Olaf's luck. For many, being born of a pleasure slave meant inheriting her status, or worse, her stigma. If the master refused to acknowledge paternity, the child remained a slave. If he accepted the child but not the mother, she might be cast out while her son or daughter was raised by the legitimate wife, a dynamic fraught with bitterness. In these households, power was doled out in careful doses. A pleasure slave might nurse her child in secret, only to have them taken away when they turned 5. Some were sent to live with foster families in distant farms. Others were raised within the same home, but taught to call their mother by her name, not her role. Never mother. They learned quickly who they were and who they weren't. But identity, once cracked, doesn't just disappear. It splinters, and those cracks ran deep into the Viking world as it stumbled into the medieval era. By the 11th century, as Christianity took firmer root, a new language of morality began to replace the old one of conquest. The church brought rules, baptism, marriage, legitimacy, but instead of freeing the children of slaves, this new order often reinforced their marginalization. Now, being born outside of marriage wasn't just a social inconvenience, it was a spiritual stain. A child of sin, of lust, of pagan flesh. These children were often denied inheritance, denied entry into the priesthood, denied marriage to noble partners, denied names, and yet they endured. In the bustling Viking trade cities of Dublin, York and Novgorod, children of mixed backgrounds grew up surrounded by people who didn't fit the mould. Traders from the east, raiders from the north, slaves from the south. It was here in these chaotic melting pots that some of them carved out new identities, free of sagas, free of noble bloodlines, just human and desperate to survive. But others weren't so lucky. The sagas don't record the names of the thousands of children who never escaped the label of thrall. We don't know the thoughts of the boy born to a Slavic mother in a Trondheim longhouse, who was whipped for looking his half-brother in the eye. We don't hear the cries of the girl who was sold alongside her mother in a spring market in Gotland. We don't know how many of these children dreamed of running away, only to be hunted down like livestock. We do know that some resisted, some escaped, and some found their way into the shadows of the very world that created them, becoming traders, mercenaries, even slavers themselves. Because that is the brutal cyclical logic of trauma unhealed. The son of a raped slave raised without love may become the kind of man who seeks control over others, confusing dominance with dignity. The daughter of a cast-off concubine may become the second wife of a warlord, using cruelty to buy a shred of status. And so the cycle turned. But occasionally there were cracks in the wheel. One such moment occurred in 1120, in Norway, when a newly crowned Christian king issued a decree: no person born of a slave mother would inherit land unless publicly recognised by the father. It was a half measure, a political compromise. But it was also the first time the state acknowledged that these children existed at all, that they were not just byproducts of lust and war, but living, breathing citizens of a changing world. By the 13th century, slavery was in decline across Scandinavia, not because of some great moral awakening, but because of economic change. As feudal structures took root and serfdom replaced outright slavery, it simply became more profitable to tie peasants to the land than to own them outright. The language changed, but the power imbalance remained. Yet even as the thrall class vanished from legal records, their descendants didn't. They lived on in the fishing villages of Iceland, in the port towns of Ireland, in the merchant families of Russia. Their stories were whispered, not written, carried in lullabies, in scars, in eyes that remembered too much. And so we return to the question, what became of the children of Viking pleasure slaves? They became the forgotten, the in-between, the ones who carried history in their blood but were never allowed to write it. But they also became proof that survival, however painful, is a kind of rebellion. That even in a world designed to erase them, they found ways to exist, to endure. In our final chapter, Section 5, we will confront the haunting legacy of it all. We'll trace how the echoes of this brutal practice reverberated beyond the Viking Age, and what it tells us about power, identity, and the human cost of domination. We will ask not just what the Vikings did, but what we choose to remember and forget about them. Imagine standing in the icy wind on a Norwegian fjord, staring at the black line of a longship slicing through grey water. To the world, it looks like a symbol of power, of adventure, of a civilization that reshaped the map of Europe. But beneath its deck, chained in silence with those broken lives we so rarely see in the history books, and their story is not over. Because the legacy of Viking pleasure slaves didn't end when the Viking Age fell. It continued, in whispers, in bloodlines, in the silent corners of ancestry that no one wanted to claim. It continued in the laws that privileged one birth over another, in the customs that allowed violence to hide behind ritual, in the way dominance was mistaken for honour, and submission was renamed loyalty. By the 13th century, the longhouses began to rot. The pagan gods were dead or buried. Christian kings now ruled Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. They outlawed human sacrifice, they outlawed slavery. They declared the old ways sinful, but laws do not erase memory. They do not undo what generations of women endured in silence, and they do not absolve the pleasure taken in breaking another human being. In the modern world, the Viking brand is alive and thriving. We see it in TV shows, video games, sports teams, even political propaganda. Vikings are cool again, rugged, rebellious, free. But that myth has a cost. It's sanitized, selective. It edits out the chains. It forgets the intimate brutality, the pleasure taken in control. It forgets the victims. When we picture Vikings today, we see axes, beards, sails. We don't see the enslaved woman forced to dance at a feast before being dragged into her master's bed. We don't see the girl dressed in fine linen, not because she's honoured, but because she's being prepared for death. We don't see the boy born of violence, raised in a home where no one says his mother's name. We don't see them, but they were there. They were the foundation of Norse society, its labour force, its domestic core, its unacknowledged cost. And their stories matter, not just as a footnote to Viking conquest, but as a mirror, held up to every society that has ever equated power with possession, dominance with greatness, conquest with glory. The Vikings were not uniquely cruel. The institution of sexual slavery has haunted every continent, every empire, every major religion. From the harems of the Abbasids to the plantations of the American South, from Roman brothels to the markets of the Ottoman world, this story is not ancient. It's human, and it's persistent. But perhaps that's why it must be told, to break the spell of glorification, to resist the seduction of blood and steel narratives that ignore the suffering beneath. Because history is not just the story of victors, it is also the story of those who survived the victors. And in the tale of Viking pleasure slaves, we see more than just a system of cruelty. We see the fragility of identity, the way power reshapes people, the way memory is weaponized or erased, and the way silence, generation after generation, becomes the greatest scar of all. But even in silence, there is strength. The slaves who never spoke their names out loud still lived. Some loved, some bore children, some stared their captors in the eye and refused to break. And even if their stories were buried, their existence was resistance. Today, their DNA lives in millions of people across Europe and beyond. Irish bloodlines laced with Baltic strands, Icelandic genes carrying traces of Iberian and Slavic mothers, unexplained ancestors in genealogy reports, shadows in the family tree, survivors, all. So when we speak of the Vikings, let us speak the full truth. Let us honour not just the raiders, but the resisted. Let us remember the stolen. Let us acknowledge the cost. Because history is not mythology, and the past, no matter how distant, still speaks, if we are brave enough to listen.